with 4 children now and with one more on the way, there's a lot of things that are true of our family and of our house, one of which is that it's never quiet. It's never quiet. And in fact, apart from the hours of about 9:30 at night and 6:15 in the morning, it's never quiet at our house. Somebody is saying something. And as parents, Caroline and I hear a lot of things. We hear a lot of questions that we have to answer. There's a lot of talking, there's a lot of giggling. But among all the sounds that we hear from our children, there's one sound that we seem to hear the most of, and that's fussing. We hear things like, Andrew hit me. Nathan took my car. Philip called me a fussy baby. All Catherine wants to watch her baby shows on TV. He hit me. He spit on me. All this kind of stuff constantly. And so in response to this, over the years, we've tried something a couple of times. And I say we tried it a couple of times because we very early discovered it does not work. What we tried is the quiet game. Some of you might have tried the quiet game. I hope you had more success than we did. But you understand how the quiet game works. You say to your kids, hey, everybody's got to be absolutely silent. And the first person to say something loses. Well, our children very quickly discover that losing at the quiet game feels very much like winning. And so we have effectively abandoned that. They don't like to be quiet. Then again, I suppose, at least in some small way, that stands to reason. Saying nothing can drive you crazy. But sometimes even more pronounced is being on the receiving end of that. Hearing nothing can be very uncomfortable. It can feel very awkward. Sometimes the silence is almost overwhelming. I remember when Caroline and I we had our first date scheduled, and I'm getting ready to leave the house that night to meet her in person for the first time. And I remember one of the things that I did was to make a mental list of subjects that I was going to kind of hold back just in the event that there was a lull in conversation. Because on a first date, when you run out of stuff to talk about and you hear nothing but crickets chirping, well, that's very uncomfortable. So I wanted to have something to say because silence can be awkward. Silence can be uncomfortable. Sometimes it can even feel painful. This past week, I felt that God was leading me away from what I had been doing, which was working through Colossians, to deal with you today on the issue of His silence. That sometimes God is not saying anything. And it's not that we don't need to hear something from Him. Rather, there are times and perhaps seasons of time where God is not saying anything. Now, it can happen collectively, it can happen individually. But if and when those times come, what are we to do? How are we to respond when God says nothing? Well, I think we've got a tremendous example for us recorded in the Bible. And if you would open with me today to Malachi chapter 3. Malachi chapter 3. If you have trouble finding that, if you can find Matthew, the first book in the New Testament, hang an immediate left just a page or so, and you'll find yourself in Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament. Malachi chapter 3. As you are looking for that, and I really hope if you don't have a Bible with you that you'll grab one from the pew rack in front of you, because I want you to see what we're told here. But to set the stage, the people of God, Israel, and if you're familiar with the Old Testament, you know what they did. They got to the point where they were just doing their own thing. They knew what God had said. They knew that they were the people of God. They knew the standards that God had, but they decided, we don't want to do that. And so God would send prophets. He would send messengers to call them back to Him, but they ignored both the messenger and the message. And so finally what God did in 586 BC was to prompt the Babylonians to come in. And they defeated Israel. They defeated the city of Jerusalem. They tore down the temple. They destroyed the city walls. The Babylonians then took these Jews, the vast majority of them, and then carted them off and dispersed them throughout the Babylonian Empire, where they would, for the foreseeable future, operate as slaves. Now, this was done by God with the intent and the purpose of drawing them and their attention back to him. And so the Babylonians come and they defeat Israel. Well, then some years later, the Persians come in and they defeat the Babylonians. And what the Persians do is to permit 50,000 Jews to go back to Jerusalem. The plan is to rebuild the temple and to resurrect the city walls. Now again, they have just as a people been judged by God. They've experienced some terribly adverse circumstances with the goal of drawing them back to the Lord. Initially, it seems that that's working because initially they come back and their hearts, their attention, their focus is back where it needs to be. But unfortunately, that attention and focus is very short-lived because within a generation or so, collectively, things are not just like they were, they're even worse. Everyone is doing just whatever they wanted to. They have effectively abandoned God, even the priests. So what happens? God raises up a man named Malachi to be his prophet. And the prophet's job is pretty simple. You share a message to the people that God gives you. And so what we have here are Malachi's delivering of a message that God gave. And so this little book, 4 chapters, this is what God says to his people on the heels of having given them tangible judgment to draw them back to him. He then speaks through Malachi, and then you turn just one page over. My Bible says the New Testament, words of Christ in red. Then there's Matthew. What's interesting is that one page turn represents 400 years. 400 years where God says nothing. No prophet, no judge, no angel with news. 400 years. 4 centuries of silence. The fact that for 400 years God says nothing should prompt us to recognize, and hopefully you're already beginning to think this, whatever God said last, that's probably fairly important. So that's what I want you to look at with me today in Malachi chapter 3. Starting in verse 13, God is talking to his people, and he says this, "Your words have been harsh," literally strong, "against me." So these are supposed to be God's people, but God says to them, you've been talking terribly about me. You've been speaking harshly in an ill manner against me. And the people operate kind of like our children do. What? Not me. No, I didn't do that. No, maybe somebody else did, but God, not me. And then it's as if God gets the tape recorder out and plays back for them what they have said. Into verse 13, they say, "God, what have we spoken against you?" And then so God says, "You have said," and then repeats their words back to them, "It is useless to serve God. What profit is it that we have kept his ordinance?" So they're saying it's useless to walk with it, to follow God. It's completely futile. It's a waste of time to obey him. For what reason have we done this? Absolutely nothing. It is a complete waste of time to follow God. It's a complete futile exercise to obey God. It's kind of like fishing with no bait. There's no fruit to be gained. There's no benefit to be experienced. So God plays that back for them. What's interesting, though, is what you see in verse 16. So the overwhelming majority of people, they've been speaking very negatively about God. Hey, it's a big fat waste of time. Verse 16, "Then those who feared the Lord spoke to one another." So big group of people, the overwhelming vast majority of supposedly of God's people say, who needs God? But then there's a group that not simply believes in him, but they're committed to him. They're serious about their walks with God. And it says they spoke to one another. Now, the passage does not tell us what they said. I think, based on context, we can at least guess the nature of their words. My suspicion is that they said things like this: "I don't get what's going on with everybody else. Honestly, I don't understand how they're saying it's completely useless and a waste of time to walk with and obey God. I don't get that. You know, I recognize that standards He's called us to, they're not always easy, and sometimes it leads me to do things I'd rather do differently, but in all honesty, I really believe it's because God has got our ultimate good in view. And I know it's not popular among our people, and certainly not popular among the nations of the world, but as for God, I'm with Him. This group, small group, together, we're going to remain with Him. What's interesting is what we're told next. The Lord listened and heard them. The Lord listened and heard them. Now, it's clear that God heard both groups. I mean, He's just told the big group what they had said against Him. He heard both groups. So what does that mean that He listened and heard this small group that's effectively praising Him? Well, how I take that is kind of like if you're in the car and you've got the radio on and a song comes on that you just love, what do you tend to do? You turn it up so that you can listen to it and enjoy it and kind of relish in it. I think that's what God's doing. He's turning up the volume of what His people, this small group, is saying of Him. And then we're told in verse 16, a book of remembrance was written before Him for those who fear the Lord and who meditate on His name. A book of remembrance was written before Him. Everyone that I looked at, every commentator, every Old Testament scholar that I looked at regarding this passage said essentially the same thing. That this book of remembrance is effectively the book of life that contains the names and the deeds of those that know and walk with God. As such, it was written before Him, suggesting that it's in heaven. Well, that's entirely possible. It really is. But that may be the right thing, but I actually disagree with that. In my personal opinion and my personal conviction is that that's not what Malachi is communicating here, that's not what actually transpired. This is not, I don't believe, a reference to the book of life that's in heaven. First of all, when it says that this book was written before Him, I believe that God, through the person of His Spirit, was present with the people that day. This little small remnant of those that are serious with God in their walks with Him. So before Him, in the person of His Spirit, a book of remembrance was written. Those of you who are parents, whether you have one child or you're like Caroline and I and you collect children, repeatedly your kids are doing stuff, saying things, responding in ways. There's memories that you're making that you tell yourself, I want to remember that. You know, for the rest of my life, that's something that I want to be able to hold on to. That's a memory that sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's heartwarming, sometimes it's endearing. But there's something that goes on with your children. You tell yourself, hey, I just want to remember that. But there's a problem. You are probably like me, and that is that we forget a lot of stuff, right? I mean, stuff you say, I want to remember that, and then you're like, I don't even remember what I was supposed to remember. So to combat that, a number of years ago, I began a file that I keep on my computer. It's just a Word document, and the file has a very exciting name. It's called Stuff I Want to Remember. And in this Word document, I've got each child's name listed, and under their name, and I go in periodically, and there's stuff that I put in there. Things that they said, things that they did. And I can look back even now, and were it not for that document, there are things that I would have already forgotten. I've got this list of stuff I want to remember. That is my book of remembrance. I believe that's what this small group was doing, is they wrote this book of remembrance in the presence of God's Spirit. Again, I could be wrong. But this is a group of people that had the Word of God as it had been originally given to the people of God through people like Moses and the other prophets, what we know as the Old Testament. And so they had the big picture, things that God had done for His people, things that God had done in the world. But I believe this book of remembrance to be very different. This isn't what God did for everybody else. This isn't what He said to everybody. This is what God has done for me. This is what He said to me. It was this book of remembrance that would sustain and nurture their faith, and even that of those that would follow them, because of what was getting ready to happen. It was getting ready to get quiet, really quiet. For 400 years, God was getting ready to say nothing. Nothing. Now, the fact that God was silent for 4 centuries should prompt you to ask a very simple question. Why didn't God say something? Why no angel? Why no prophet? Why no priest? Why no judge? Why not somebody to say something to his people for 400 years? Well, I believe there's a couple of answers, and the first is fairly obvious, and that is sheer disobedience. Sheer disobedience. The vast, overwhelming majority of people in Malachi's days, they had thumbed their noses at God. They've just said to the God of the universe, we really don't need you. There's no use in following you. There's no benefit to be gained in obeying you. It's a complete abject waste of time. And so we're going to do what we want to do. That's what they were doing before Malachi spoke, and that's what they continue to do. In short, or put another way, they weren't interested in hearing anything from God. And so they heard nothing from Him. I believe in that there's some application for us. Let me ask you, when is the last time you knew that God had said something to you? And I don't mean in an audible voice. I don't mean that the burning bush was out in your front yard. But there was something that God put on your mind, something that He put on your heart, and you knew this is from God. It might have been encouraged long enough to give Him an opportunity to speak to you. Or is it perhaps that you have been very much like the people in Malachi's day, and you might not have actually said this, but the truth is your life bears out that the mentality of the people then has been your mentality. God, I can do this without Him. And you're perfectly content to live your life. The average day involves no investment of God or no invitation of God into the goings-on of your day. Could it be that you just haven't really wanted to hear anything from Him? If that's the case, do you want it to remain that way? I believe 400 years of silence, the greatest reason for that is because of the disobedience of His people. They didn't want to hear from God, and so He wasn't going to force His words on their ears. But there is another reason. Sometimes I believe the occasional silence of God is not a response to disobedience. Rather, it's because He is at work, doing things, oftentimes behind the scenes. And sometimes He can even be doing work out on stage, but we don't have the ability or the discernment to recognize His fingerprints and to see and understand exactly what it is that He is doing. I think that's part of the reason for the silence during these 400 years, these intertestamental years. Let me see if I can explain. By the time Malachi is prophesying, the Persians are in control. By 332 BC, a guy named Alexander the Great comes in and he conquers the Persians. So the Persian Empire becomes the Greek Empire, led by Alexander the Great. Among the things that Alexander does is not simply to import Greek government and Greek culture, but also the Greek language. It, throughout the empire, becomes the known language. Conquered peoples have to learn this language. It was during this time that the Old Testament scriptures are finally translated into Greek, a translation we know as the Septuagint. So all of a sudden, the number of people that are able to be exposed to the Word of God, it grows exponentially. Well, that's Alexander. In 63 BC, a Roman conqueror named Pompey comes in and he conquers Alexander's empire. And so this region of Judea or Palestine becomes subject now to the Caesars. And that's in 63 BC. It's about 60 years later, between 3 and 4 BC, when we believe Jesus to have actually been born. So get this, 400 years, God says nothing. The next time he says something is through an angel to Mary and then to Joseph. The next time that he gives a message to be conveyed to other people is through a New Testament prophet named John the Baptist, who said very simply in Mark 1 verse 3, "Prepare the way of the Lord." I hope the pieces are starting to fall into place in your mind, but if they're not, let me see if I can help you arrange for a moment. The last words we have of God are in Malachi, before 400 years of silence. During that 400 years, a singular world power conquers the known world, and there is a shared universal language. It is into that world that Jesus comes onto the scene. There is his birth, his life, his ministry, his death, burial, and his resurrection. And after that, there's the founding of the church. And what happens? It begins to spread like wildfire. Well, what makes that possible? Well, you've got a Roman Empire that has built legions of cities and towns and villages. There's an organized, systematic system of government. There are significant roads, paved roads, and traveling routes. Beyond that, there is a shared language throughout the empire. And so the message of Jesus spreads like wildfire. The last thing God says is in Malachi, 400 years transpire, and then the next time God says something is through an angel. And he says to her, "Blessed are you among women." It describes that she's going to conceive and give birth to a son and call his name Jesus. And the message spreads like crazy. What does that tell us? It tells us that for 400 years, God was at work. Even though he was saying nothing, he was actively at work preparing for the next thing he was going to do, for the next thing that he was going to say. So when that message came, it could spread like crazy. Well, what then is the application for us? Well, if it seems to you that heaven is silent, well, it could be because you've been like the people in Malachi's day. You said, "God, who really needs you?" If that's not the case, it could very well be because God is putting pieces of a puzzle together and things are not yet ready for you to hear and to see what's next. All of this leads us to a final question that, if you think about it long enough, you'd probably come up with. What do I do when God is silent towards me? What do I do when I'm experiencing seasons of time where I don't feel like I'm hearing anything? The truth is there's a whole varied litany of responses that you can have, but I think all of those responses can be divided essentially into three categories. The first category of response, and I think all of these are demonstrated by people in the lives or in the day of Malachi and the years that followed. The first response is to just do what you were doing in the first place. There were lots of people in Malachi's day, they had tuned God out and they had turned him off. That's what they had been doing before God quit speaking. And so when he stopped speaking, nothing changed. They weren't paying any attention in the first place. They didn't care what he said when he was talking, and so when he wasn't saying anything, no big deal. They were doing what they wanted when he was speaking, and they continued to do what they wanted when he wasn't speaking. That's the first category of response. The second category of response is typified by the religious leadership of the day. You get to the end of Malachi, and 400 years of silence begin. God is saying nothing. And so the religious leadership of the day decides, you know what, God's not saying anything, so what we will do is to presume to speak for him. Since he's not saying anything, we'll just tell people what God wants them to hear, because we clearly know what that is. And so you had in the Old Testament, for example, in the Ten Commandments, you shall honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Well, God didn't flesh that out completely, so they decided we will and were capable of speaking for God. And so they began to develop series of teachings comprising layer after layer after layer of rules, onerous, excessive rules, so that they would say to people, all right, this is what God said, but this is what he really meant. And so on the Sabbath day, you can walk this many steps before it constitutes work, and then beyond that, you better stop in your tracks. Or you can move a chair just a few feet, but if you pick it up and take it across the room, that's work. You can't do that. So when God wasn't speaking, they decided, hey, we will speak for him. We'll create all these rules. Now, what happened because of actions such as that is that this religious leadership began to develop a sense of elitism. We are so, these people. I mean, clearly, we know what God wants, and these are all the standards that we've codified in our rules, and this is how God wants everybody to operate, and these people, they're not doing it. They're just beneath us. They're just beneath us. They thought they were so good. Well, there's that response. Speak for him. First option, do whatever you want like you were doing before. The third option that some took, some I think mentioned by Malachi, is this. Focus on and cling to what God has done and has said. Put another way, if God is not saying anything right now, you tell yourself, I'm going to focus on what he's already said and what he's already done. How did they do that? You see it in verse 16. They had that book of remembrance that was written. They got their list of stuff I always want to remember about God, and they dwelt on it. During seasons of discouragement and fear, they reminded themselves of how God had comforted them in the past. During seasons of uncertainty, wondering what direction they should go, they reminded themselves of how God had guided them in the past. During seasons of absolute silence, not hearing anything from heaven, they reminded themselves of how God had spoken to them, and it nurtured their faith. It sustained them. It encouraged them even when God was silent. I believe that is significant because what's the next thing God says? 400 years of silence, what's the next thing that God says? He says it through an angel. He says it to Mary. The Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women. You have found favor with God. You will conceive in your womb and bring forth a son, and you shall call his name Jesus. Isn't that interesting? 400 years of silence, and to what group does he speak to? He doesn't bring a message to people who had tuned him out. He doesn't bring the message to the religious elite of the day. He brings it to a young woman who had been taught and led to focus on what God had said and what he has done. So where does this leave us? Where does this leave you? How do we bring all this together? Well, let me see if I can tie this up for you today by asking you a few questions. First of all, have you been hearing anything from God? Have you been hearing anything from God? If the answer is no, I haven't, or it's been an awfully, awfully long time. Let me follow that out by saying, could it be because you haven't stopped to listen? Or maybe because you haven't really wanted to hear. You've been so content doing things your way, you haven't been interested in hearing that he wants things to be different. If that's the case, if that's why you haven't been hearing anything, do you want it to stay like that? Maybe you would say, I feel like, no, that's not me. I feel like there are things that God's put on my heart, things that he's put on mine. I feel like God speaks to me. Well, let me ask you, if he were to give you the silent treatment and begin the quiet game with you, during that time, what would you rest on? Have you been making any memories of what God has said, what he has done, not simply for the world, not simply in the pages of the Bible, but what he's done for you, what he said to you? Do you have anything so that when the silence comes and those seasons of quiet come, to nurture and sustain your faith? anything to fall back on? Well, if the answer is no, are you ready to start making a book of remembrance? And it doesn't have to be something necessarily physically that you'd write down. It's not a bad idea. But at the very least, on your heart, etched in your mind, this is what God has done, not simply for the world. This is what He's done for me. This isn't what He said just to Malachi or to Jeremiah or to David or to Paul. This is what He said to me. And then will you ask God to give you the eyes to see and the discernment to recognize His work, even when it seems as though He's not saying anything? The simple truth is that even dealing with the subject of silence, God's silence, I believe that He's spoken today. The question is not simply, have you heard? The question is, have you listened? In response now to a God who speaks, what now will you do? Will you bow your heads with me?